Well, I've got a treat for you today. We're at the private home of an antiques collector. And that's often where you find some of the best and rarest antiques, such as this Delft rack. This was used to display the Delft ware, and these little compartments were nice for putting in little knickknacks. Now, I'm told that a piece like this could date back as early as 1780. It would have been painted, but it's been stripped back to this nice pine and waxed. Now, it looks a lot simpler than it really is. I noticed that all the cutouts here, the fretwork on the front and on the divider, are all slightly different. So not only am I going to have to take some careful measurements, but I'm going to have to make some very accurate patterns of all the fretwork. When I get that done, I'll take it back to the shop and we can see what we can do. Well, here it is, our version of the antique Delft rack. And since I've run out of wall space in the workshop, I hung a cleat in front of our door, put it up here so we could come back and look at it several times today. Now, this is a pretty faithful reproduction of the original, except I made mine from oak, because where this is going to go in my house, I have a lot of other oak pieces. This is really a project of details. Fluted casings, decorative cutouts, fretwork across the top, and a built-up cornice molding. So in order to make a faithful reproduction, because it's not going to be easy to just make another trip across the pond to take a measurement, I made a lot of notes, I took a lot of photographs, and when I got back here, I immediately transferred them onto poster board in the form of full-scale patterns. Now, to get started on our project today, the first pieces that I want to work on are the end and this partition in the middle. And this full-scale pattern really has a dual purpose. It gives me the cutout at the bottom of the side and the location of all the shelves, and it also gives me the decorative cutouts in the partition. Now, here are the two pieces of oak for the sides. Using the pattern, I laid out the cutout at the bottom, and I always want to make sure that I have mirror image pieces, a left and a right, so I've laid out one the opposite way. Using the same pattern, I've located all the shelves, one here, 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 and here. I want to make a dado at each location, so I've set up my stacked dado head cutter in my radial arm, and I've used a piece of scrap, the same thickness, to check the depth of the dado cut. The width of the dado is 11/16. Now, with everything set, we'll run the sides through. Well, now let's work on these two partitions. They also need several dados. On either side, one for this shelf and this one, another one here and here. But up at the top, only a dado on the outer side because there's no shelf in the middle. All right, now this piece is for the bottom shelf of the Delft rack, and it needs two dados, one on each end, to receive the partitions. So I've narrowed the dado head cutter to 3/8, and I'm ready to run those through. While the dado head cutter is still in the radial arm, I'm going to make a notch in the partitions for a hanging cleat. And to do that, I want to make sure that I install a high fence to support the work. Now, the end panels and the partitions need one long notch at the upper front portion, and that's to receive the panel, which has all the fancy cutouts. Now, if I use the radial arm now to make a pass right here, I'll get a nice square corner. Then I'll finish the rip over at the table saw. Now, using a little jig that I made and my router, which is set up with a collar and a 1/2-inch straight bit that just sort of rides around the cutout in the jig, I've made a mortise. And I'm making one in each of the sides, and that's to receive the hanging cleat. The only thing left to do is to clean up these little corners. And I'm going to use this tool here, which is just a little corner chisel that's spring-loaded, and it does a great job. The next step is to start making the decorative cutouts in the partitions and in the panel across the top. And to do that, I'm going to use what's known as a scroll saw. The scroll saw has an advantage over the jigsaw or the bandsaw basically in the blade. because it has a very thin, narrow blade with fine teeth, which means that you can cut very tight radii, and it cuts very smoothly, so smooth that you really don't even have to sand. But with those advantages comes a disadvantage in that it's a very slow tool. And because the blade is delicate, they break frequently. But if I take my time, I get really good results. Well, as you can see, even with the 20-inch throat on my scroll saw, there's still some inside corners and cut areas that I can't reach. So I'm finishing them up with my handheld jigsaw and the finest, narrowest blade I could find. Now here I have a little decorative cutout that's in the middle of that top panel. So I'm going to drill a hole first. Now I have a place to put my jigsaw to make the cutout. Each of the long shelves has 2 plate grooves. And what those are for is so that you can catch the edge of the plate and it leans against the wall and the bottom won't kick out. Now, it's very easy to make that groove using a router with a 1/4-inch round nose bit and a guide fence. I've marked the shelf where I want to start and stop the groove, and all I have to do is plunge it down into the work and go to the other mark. Well, after sanding any remaining pencil marks that were on the pieces that we've milled so far, I'm finally ready for some assembly. A little bit of yellow carpenter's glue in the dado and on the end of the bottom shelf, and we'll just nail it together with some 1.25 finish nails. Now we're ready for the upper panel. And I'm not going to use glue here because I have a cross-grain gluing situation. Just a couple brads to hold it in place. Well, now I'm ready for the intermediate shelves. One's through the center portion. And we just slip those in the dado and nail it with an 1.25 finish nail. Okay, well, that just about takes care of all of the main assembly. But there's still some casings to make, a little more fretwork to cut out, some moldings, and, of course, the top cornice. But I think I'll wait for tomorrow to do that. Well, I'm getting started this morning laying out the pieces of stock which will become the casings. And I'm putting lines so that I'll know where to begin and end the fluted detail that's on the front of the casing. Now, there are 8 flutes, about 1/8 of an inch apart. There's a couple different ways I could make them. One would be to use a router like I did on the shelf plate grooves. That leaves just a half-round ending, and I kind of like this tapered end. So to accomplish that effect, I'm going to use my molding head cutter in my table saw. And the molding head is just a heavy wheel that you can put different profiles of cutters in. The cutters that are in the head now are a 1/2-inch cove and a 1/4-inch flute. I'm using just the 1/4-inch flute section, which is set to be only about 1/8 of an inch above the table. Now, to get to the effect, what I'm going to have to do is lower the piece down over the cutter. So I've put an indicator mark at the beginning and one at the end. And to get the next one, I'm just going to turn the piece side to side, do the same process, and I'll end up with the first 2 flutes in the center. Okay. Now, after making a couple trial runs on this piece of scrap, I've now got it adjusted to make 2 more of the flutes. But once again, a sample on my scrap for the next two. And with the final adjustment of the fence, I'm ready for the outer two flutes. These small decorative pieces can be nailed to the partition, but I'm going to have to mortise them into the casing, and I'll do that next. This is the same technique you saw me use earlier, except the jig is slightly smaller. Well, now we're going to do a little more assembly. Some glue on the side and the shelves where the casing meets them, and I'll simply fasten them in place with some 1-inch brads. Now we'll just fasten all these decorative elements in place. The next thing I want to work on is this base detail at the bottom of the casings. It's really two parts, a molding and a square baseboard. We'll start with the square part first. Before I do anything else, I want to make the 5 pieces that either form an edge for the shelf or a retainer to hold the plate safely. All right, there's the first pass through my router shaper table, and what I've done is created a quarter round with a little lip on it, just using a 3/8-inch radius coving bit. Now if I turn the piece over and run the other edge, I'll get the half-round profile I want. Now to get the full thickness 3/4-inch stock down to the profile I want, I'm going to make a couple passes through the joiner. Now the rest of the project is really a series of moldings. Let me show you how I made this base molding. Here at the table saw, the molding head cutter is still installed. Earlier I used the fluting portion of the bit. Now I'm going to use the coving portion of the bit. I'm just going to take a little bit with each pass. Now I'll just raise the cutter a bit and make another pass. One more final adjustment. The rest of the profile is milled using my router shaper table and a 3/8-inch bead concave cutter. Now all I have to do is rip this piece on my table saw, and I'll get 2 nicely formed pieces of base molding. You might have noticed that I used that same base molding for a little band up here at the top, except that I just flipped it over. Now I'm ready to start working on the cornice molding, which is actually made up of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 individual pieces. First I'll show you how I made this bottom piece. Over here at my router shaper, I've installed a cutter, which is a combination type. It has a radius for a bead and a cove. I'm going to use the cove portion. I can't make the final cut in one pass, so I'll take a little bit at a time. Next, I want to rip off this excess that's left at the bottom edge of the molding. Now, with the molding head cutter reinstalled in the table saw and a cutter which will make a small bead, I'll form the bottom of the molding. The next piece that I'm going to install just simply sits on top of the molding we just put on, hangs over about 1/16 of an inch. I made it over at the table saw with the blade tipped at a 20-degree angle. Okay, that takes care of that band. The next piece is a piece of 1/4-inch stock that's rounded over on the front edge, and that hangs out over this beveled piece about 1/4 of an inch. And I'll show you how I made that. Well, back at the router shaper table, I've installed a 1/4-inch bead concave. And I'm just going to run this 1/4-inch by 1 1/8" stock through, milling one edge. Well, with just 2 passes through the molding head cutter, I've created this bead using the 3/8" radius bit. Now all I want to do is rip it to the right thickness. Now this strip of pine acts as a backer for the final piece of the cornice. Now, with my table saw blade tipped to a 45-degree angle, I'm just going to knock off the corner of this piece. Well, it won't be long now. So at last, the final piece. A lot of work, but worth it, don't you think? Now all I have to do is put on the finish. Now to decide the final finish that I wanted, I ran a few samples on some scraps of white oak. I tried plain wax, wax with a little bit of stain in it, and just plain stain. Finally decided that this was the finish I wanted. This is a Danish oil finish, which has a tung oil base. And I darkened it just a little bit with an English walnut stain. I'm just putting it on with the brush. After it dries about 8 hours, I'll put on another coat. And the more coats I put on, the better it's going to look. Well, after 3 coats of that English walnut stain mixed in with the Danish oil, this piece is starting to take on a character all its own. It's a very interesting piece, and I can't wait to see it filled with some china. Now, next time we will return to England, where we will take you to an antiques factory, where the fancy antiques that you'll pay a fortune tomorrow for in London are being created from what we would consider rubbish. In fact, we saw an old workbench that was going to be converted into a, quote, antique coffee table like this one. We'll show you that and how to build one of these tables next time right here on the New Yankee Workshop.
For those of you lucky enough to have a plasma screen TV, Paul Bradburn has something just for you next. Cutting-edge stuff.